Slide, Understanding the National Disability Insurance Scheme, NDIS. Video 3, The NDIS Explained, an AFDO Disability Loop Workshop.
Slide saying, the NDIS Explained, with an image of a person at a desk, sign on the front of the desk says NDIS.
A view of presenters sitting at a table at the front of the room. She reads notes from a braille booklet.
So let's explain the NDIS. The NDIS, it's a completely new system of disability support in Australia, and it started replacing other disability supports that have been around in the different territories and states. And it will continue to roll out up until about 2020, when it should be fully rolled out in Australia. The aim of the NDIS is to support people with a permanent and a significant disability that affects their ability to take part in everyday activities. Now that sentence is really important, so I'll come back to that later on, but that's a key sentence. But it's important to know that children and adults can also access a thing called early intervention supports through the NDIS. It's another part of the NDIS. They can access early intervention if the benefit to the person would reduce their future need for disability support. So imagine if a child had some speech issues and they had speech intervention, so speech therapy, then they may not need that support later in life. So it helps them now, so they don't need the help in the future. Early intervention can also be because it helps slow down the deterioration of a medical condition. So maybe you've got something like multiple sclerosis, and by having an early intervention, you can have some therapy that slows down the rate of deterioration of that condition. Or it might give you increased functionality. Can you imagine someone who doesn't have very strong legs and they use crutches? So if they are able to get some strength training support, they might be able to use their crutches for longer and therefore not need to progress to a wheelchair until later. So their functionality is improved. So early intervention is one part, but the biggest part of the NDIS is what they call individual funded packages, or we'll just call them plans, but it's the money directly to the people that get the NDIS plans. And that's what we're going to be talking about mostly today. There are other parts of the NDIS. There's a thing called information, linkages and capacity building. ILC, we say for short. And that's basically a large component of the NDIS that focuses on making communities accessible. So helping the whole community. Think of your neighbourhoods, your working area, they're different communities. And there's probably a lot of things in your communities that could be made more accessible, both for the person with disability, but also increasing understanding of everyone in that community about disability. So the ILC helps develop that by giving funding to organisations to run programs, but they also have this part of the NDIA called LAC, Local Area Coordinators. Some of you may have heard of local area coordinators. They're staff that do the work for the NDIS, and part of their job is to make sure communities improve on their accessibility.
Slide saying, the NDIS is different.
The NDIS is different. So when people use the NDIS, it's very different to how they used it before. Firstly, there's going to be a lot more resources available to the whole sector. There'll be more money. I think they're estimating about twice as much funding will be around. What do you think would be the benefit of having twice as much money in the sector? More service providers can be employed, yes, exactly. And more service providers means better support for people, doesn't it? So it means that people are likely to get the support they need and the support they want. Secondly, it won't matter where you live. You can move around Australia because your NDIS plan goes with you. So you don't have to reapply if you want to move interstate. And thirdly, it will allow people with much more choice and control over how they live their life. So if they want to shower at 7 a.m, they'll be able to do that rather than having to shower at 7 p.m, for example, because there'll be more service providers.
Slide saying NDIS related definitions. Image of presenter in front of board that reads NDIS with audience of 3 people.
I want to talk about some definitions because with the NDIS comes a whole lot of new language. It's a new scheme, a lot of new language, so it's good to understand just some of the language that's used. We've talked a little bit about service providers, but some people don't know what a service provider is. A service provider is just someone that an organisation, usually a large or a small organisation, but sometimes it can just be a one-person service provider. They're the people that provide you the support. So, for example, if Jess set up her own business, so she's just doing it as a favour today. Cheryl kindly talked her into it. I don't know what she's bribed her with. But for example, if Jess set up her business, she could be a support service provider. So there's some big service providers you may have heard of. The service providers I use are Vision Australia, Guide Dogs. They're 2 big service providers. I'm sure you can think of some other service providers that come to mind. What are some of the other service providers you know of?
Local councils.
The local council do, yes, they do provide service provision. But they are a local government service, but yes, they are a service provider. But there's organisations out there. I think some of you even work for some of them. So,
I'm sorry, I was just thinking of YMCA.
the YMCA, yeah, I guess so. I guess they are a business and they provide service. I'm thinking more of disability service providers. So the council, for example, do have service provision, but there's a lot of organisations out there that in the past may have been thought of as charities, but now are seen as service providers. So they're people that help you. Think of it as organisations that help you with your disability needs.
Would that be like the RDNS, the Royal District Nursing?
The Royal District Nursing is a service that is more health oriented, but yeah, that's a service provider in the health sector rather than a service provider in the disability sector, yeah. Yes?
Cheryl, I was thinking about like Urella and maybe is it Inclusion Melbourne?
Yes, there's Inclusion Melbourne, as you say. There is also Urella, Scope. There's some of the bigger organisations, and there will be different ones in different states, of course. But some of them are national service providers, some are state-based, and some are very small. That's right.
And I wanted to ask you, it's seen again, I was just wondering, you know whether like mental health, whether mind and
Absolutely.
Are they the service providers? Yeah.
Yes, they are. So you've mentioned Mind Australia. They are definitely a service provider. And so that's right. So they're in the mental health space. Exactly.
Slide saying the NDIA.
The NDIA, that stands for the National Disability Insurance Agency. And we just commonly call it the NDIA, or we call it the agency. So when I talk about the agency in this session, I'm not talking about the agencies like Guide Dogs or Mind. People call them agencies, but in this context, the agency means the National Disability Insurance Agency, okay? And that was set up by the federal government when the NDIA started. So the government set up the agency to run the NDIA. Everyone that works in that agency, they have to follow the Act and what the Act says. They also follow what they call operational guidelines, the NDIA operational guidelines.
Slide saying the NDIS Act.
The NDIS Act Rather than saying the National Disability Insurance Scheme Act 2013, which is quite a mouthful, we'll just say the Act. But basically that's a law. That's the legal top high-level law that says what the NDIS is all about. It talks about what's lawful and what's unlawful, what can be done by law in the NDIS. If you didn't have that law, you wouldn't have the NDIS.
Slide saying the NDIS operational guidelines.
Then you've got the NDIS operational guidelines. So those guidelines, they're another formal set of documents that are very important, separate from the Act, and they are drawn up by the NDIA. And they're used to make sure that the NDIS is carried out in accordance with the Act. So they're a bit more detailed. They're more like the operational plan or the action plan, whereas the Act is just high level. The operational guidelines are more specific with more detail about do this, don't do that, make your decisions in this way. And everyone that works in the NDIA follows those operational guidelines, so they're all doing the same thing around the country. They're all consistent. They all make the same decisions according to the same rules.
Slide saying NDIS planners and other NDIS representatives.
Then you might have heard of other terms like NDIS planners and NDIS representatives. They are the people that work in the agency. They're the people that the person with a disability is likely to meet with to do their planning, etc. And they are people that work with the NDIA. But the agency can't be everywhere. They can't be all over Australia. So they have organisations that help them. So for example, here in Victoria we have the NDIA based at Geelong, for example. Now they are in other places in Victoria, but that's just one place. But for example, they can't be in some of the southern suburbs, so they get other agencies, other organisations to do their work with them and for them on their behalf, and they're called partners in the community. So if you hear the term partner, it means they're another agency that work and do the work for the NDIA. There are lots of different partners. In my home state of Victoria, there are partners such as the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, the La Trobe Community Health, Interchange. There's quite a few different partners, and they will be based on locations. So throughout New South Wales, Queensland, and all the other states, there's different partners in different areas. Those partners will do one or other or both of two main roles. Do you remember I mentioned local area coordinator? They're the people that look after 7-year-olds up to 65-year-olds. So they do all the work with that group, LACs. The other partners look after early childhood, early intervention. So they're the ones that look after people 6 years and under. Sometimes it's the same organisation. So for example, Brotherhood of St Lawrence, they're both the LAC and the early childhood. In other areas, they may be two different partners looking after each of those jobs. I hope that makes sense. And all of those reps, as I said, they all have to follow the Act and the operational guidelines, just so everything is consistent. The big term that you'll hear all the time is plan. So what is a plan? What is an NDIS plan? Well, that's an official document that includes all your reasonable and necessary supports. And we're going to do an activity later about reasonable and necessary, because that is the term you'll hear even more than plan, I'm sure. It's a really key thing to understand. But the plan contains all your supports that are reasonable and necessary that they're going to fund.
Production of the AFDO Disability Loop Understanding the NDIS video series has been made possible with funding from the Victorian Government. AFDO would like to thank video participants and those who provided feedback on video drafts for their contributions. Video services, audio description and captioning by AngryChair. Auslan interpreting by Auslan Services. Remember to visit disabilityloop.org.au.